here we are at week 9 of our 9-week program. And my talk title today is, Greg, my microphone is not, I haven't changed anything. Well, looks like the battery may have died. Looks like we're going to need a new battery, so it's on, but it's warning that the battery is on its last legs. So as I was saying, the talk title for today is God the Perfect Mirror. And we have been studying over the last 9 weeks Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ, which gives us a whole new way of looking at the Christ. That the Christ is just another name for everything and everyone. So it is this inclusivity of everything. That's really the Christ. And having that consciousness and awareness is what we're about. But the thing is, as much as I have told this message, you've been told over the last 9 weeks, telling is not training. Telling is not getting it. Telling is just hearing. And we know that. We can hear something, we can hear a message, and it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. So how do we make this message stick? You know, if we've gone through 9 weeks of study and reading the book and discussing it in our groups, how do we hold on to that message so that we really embody it? So that's really what we're going to talk about today. Because just more info isn't going to do us any good. We know that. We're saturated with info from the internet, from all these different channels. And it really overwhelms us. It doesn't do us any good. We need this awareness of that new understanding of the Christ presence to get into our cellular memory, to rewire us neurologically, so that we begin to see in a new way and experience in a new way everything and everyone. So that it's not just a theological doctrine. It's not something, that we've heard. We're looking for an actual experience of what it means to have that Christ consciousness embedded in us, so that when we look at the world, we're doing so as this universal Christ mind would. So how do we really rewire our responses? And of course the answer is that, like anything, if you want to learn to play the piano, you have to practice. If you want to be an athlete, you have to run. So we have to have some spiritual practice that we engage in that makes this come alive for us. And Richard Rohr defines spiritual practice as in the following way. It's standing in the flow, whereas theory is just observing the flow from a position of separation. So it's immersing ourselves into the flow of this message and of the energy that it carries. Meaning that the Christ is just another name for everything. Can I stand in the flow of that energy, of that information? Not just up here, but can I feel it viscerally, physically? Can I have an experience of everything being one, and of my being one with everything and with everybody? Because that's the heart of the book. So seeing clearly and getting out of our own conditioning and of our own programming is really key then. It's very important that we know what the obstacle is. It's our own mind that has been programmed to think very differently. I, me, my, I'm going to achieve. This is a 180 viewpoint. It's a we viewpoint of our lives and of the world. And so we need a new worldview. And a worldview is not something that we look at, it is something that we look out from. It is something that we look through. It's a filter, if you will, a lens, or it's a perspective, it's a prejudice. It can be a prejudice for something or a prejudice against something. So we're talking here about our unconscious biases, aren't we? The things that we're not really aware of, and we have to try to become aware of them. But here's the thing. We're asking the mind to call the cops on itself. We're asking our minds that are so taken with, what it thinks and how it sees, to be able to step back from itself and to observe itself. The Untethered Soul was a great book that we read a few years ago. Michael Singer wrote that book, and it's all about learning to observe the mind. So if you feel like you still haven't got that one down, you might want to reach back and take out that book and reread it. Or if you've never read it, that is, again, one of the great books from the last 10 years. How do we observe ourselves? How do we become conscious and aware of ourselves? See, the first thing we have to do is we have to catch on to the game that we're playing and what the rules are according to me. What's my game? What are my rules? Because each one of us has our own little game going, our own little con about reality, and we're trying to catch on to what that is. So, to go back to the definition of what a spiritual practice is, we have to step into the flow of something quite different from our usual game plan, our usual playbook. And what we have to notice is, what's the resistance that we have individually to this idea that there's only one being, and that somehow I must be connected and care about this one being as it shows up individually in other people and all around me as the planet? You know that resistance is part of how electricity operates. If you have a wire, electricity flows through the wire. But the wire it forms a resistance. It kind of slows it down. So in the same way, you could say that our human mind and thinking is acting like the resistance in a wire to God, with our connection to the divine. And it's coming up with all of these things that are going to stop us from fully experiencing the divine. Things such as anger, blame, that's a really good one, takes the focus off me. Fear, avoidance, projection. So as long as I can look out at you and somehow project my shadow, my unconscious, onto you, I'm never going to wake up. Denial, judgment, pretense. We have a whole list of little games that we're playing, and we're not even aware of the fact that we're playing these games and that it's obscuring our view of ourselves and the bigger picture of how the divine really is present and showing up. So that resistance shows up as a pushback to this idea of, you could say, the one world view, the one community view. Am I responsible? Am I my brother's keeper, my sister's keeper? All of those type of things come up for us. And they run our lives, and they ruin our experience of life. Because as long as we are thinking in terms of separation, we're not going to be very happy, because we're always going to have a hand up in defense, protecting ourselves, and we're always only going to be letting some people in. My microphone go? Okay. You got the battery for me? Okay. Here's Dennis, the savior.
He has the power.
No, it's okay. Let's see if they're dead batteries that he's brought. Okay, here we go. Very good. Thank you. Richard Rohr says that in the bigger picture of things, there are 4 worldviews that we deal with, 4 conditionings. And the first is the material worldview, where we just think of all of this just in terms of the material, that there's no spiritual, there's no being outside of us, there's no God, there's no divine, there's no spirit. And so people engage the world in that way, and it's just physical, it's just material. And the problem that brings up then is a sense of scarcity. And if we only focus on the material, then we're going to live in this world of fear and of scarcity. Last Sunday we had a meeting about our finances, and I addressed this. But the first thing we have to do is to heal the fear that we have around things like money, or the sense of scarcity, that there isn't enough. That's a very common metaphor, not a metaphor, a mantra that people have running in their head. There isn't enough, and therefore I must hoard. So that's the first worldview. The second worldview is opposite to that it's the spiritual worldview. And this takes things to the other extreme. That, in a sense, the people who are in this worldview see everything as spiritual. And there's almost a naivete about that. That they're not really engaging with the world. They've got these rose-tinted glasses on, and it's just a kind of a Pollyanna view of life and of the world. But it's disembodied. You know, it's kind of like they're out of their body almost already. And a lot of it then, of course, is that all of this is just illusion. So it's a way of dismissing the day-to-day experience that we all go through. And he says the third worldview is what he calls the priestly worldview. And that one attempts to join matter and spirit together. He said the basic foundational principle there is that it needs to be joined together. And so what it really peddles is separation. That you have the physical and you have the spiritual. We need to bring these two together somehow. And of course, very often, it peddles a mediator out there. We're very familiar with that priestly worldview. Many religions are based on that. And then he says there's the fourth worldview, which he calls incarnation. And it's the worldview that sees everything as one already. That there never was a separation except in our minds, in our thoughts. And that it says all we have to do is wake up to that reality. It's already a reality. We just need to be aware that we are one with the divine already. It's right there in Genesis, and God said it was good, and very good. And there we come in then with Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ, the Christ consciousness. It's really just seeing everything as one. Christ is another name for everything. And knowing that we are all one. And that, in a sense, all of this is simply love in manifestation. And so, if we talk about Christ holiness, or wholeness, it's very much grounded in the reality of our isness, of our humanity. It's not something up there that we're striving for. It's something grounded in our very physicality and in our human experience and day-to-day experience. It's not based on our moral behavior, because we know that we all go up and down when it comes to moral behavior. We have some good days and some bad days. We do better some days than others. But you see, the worldview of the incarnation is not based on that. It's saying even in our worst days, we're still the divine. It's just we're not understanding that we are, and we certainly aren't behaving that way. But that's not it's not that important really at the end of the day. The thing that we need to focus on is the fact that we are the divine, and that then will cause us to be the light and to behave in ways that are kind and loving and moral. So we have these approaches then that grip onto the control and keep a tight grip on everything. The first three. As opposed to the fourth one, the incarnational view, which is a relaxing, a letting go, and enjoying even of life. That we are this wonderful mix of human and divine. And, of course, it calls us then to be hands-on in our spirituality and in our religion. If you and I are one, then surely I'm concerned about you. And I'm going to reach out to you, and I'm going to help you. So all of the social action that we talk about is implied in there. The reason why we would feed the homeless is because I'm feeding myself, my true self. I'm feeding the divine in human form in someone who doesn't have a roof over their head. And of course, the problem with all of this is that we keep substituting something else for the truth that we are this infinite divine being. And we're very good at that. Every day, it's like our mind wakes up and it has completely forgotten about all of our consciousness from yesterday where we were really focused on being the Christ. And it's like, we wake up this morning and it's like it never happened. Now there are all these new ways that, again, we have to deprogram ourselves every day. So there's a vigilance required. And we're missing the loving identification and the experience of the union with the divine that's in front of us in every second. Coming up, showing up differently. It's like it's a live stream. It's never the same. I always say that to the groups, when we gather each week. It's never the same group of people. There's always one person who isn't there, or someone else new might show up. And anyway, we're all different from last week. So just in this very moment this morning, the divine is showing up as who's here. It's a different configuration. It's the kaleidoscope that's changing always. And then each one of us is this vibrant energy here this morning that's different from when we gathered last week. And that's the process of the divine entering into physicality, of the spirit coming into matter, into humanity. It's always refreshing itself. It's always streaming anew. And it's going through a cycle and a process that Richard Rohr says has three phases. It starts out with order, it goes to disorder, and then it comes back to reorder. So you could think of the divine in itself at the very beginning, and it was just the divine as spirit. So that was the order. And then it threw itself out there into this universe, or the universes, and it became like a disorder. And so it had to sort of get its balance again, so it could come back to the original order. And that's really like the big picture of what's going on. And each one of us, as the divine, is going through that process in our life, from birth to death and beyond. We're going through order. We start off as children. We often have that sense of our worth, our innocence. We're so connected to angels and to the divine, and it's just all wonderful. And then you hit puberty, or something. For me, it was puberty. I was telling my story yesterday. And we go through this discombobulation about who and what we are, and we're floundering, trying to get the solid ground again of who am I? What's going on? How can I get back to that original innocence? And then eventually you come to some place like unity. Because unity is very much the third category. All of you, I know you've been through the order. You've all been through the disorder in your life. And you have come back to reorder. And you wouldn't be in unity unless you've been through that experience. Because that's what this spirituality is all about. Joseph Campbell calls it the hero's journey. There's a going out into life, into the world. There's getting lost. And then there's finding yourself and making the journey back home. And we're all part of that journey together, coming back home. It's right there in the very first chapter of the Bible, Genesis. We have the story of the Garden of Eden, order. Then we have the story of the fall, disorder. And then we have the rest of the Bible really showing the journey backward to what they call the Christ, coming back into unity consciousness. You have it in the story of the Jewish people. They were in Israel. They get kicked out. They go into Egypt, the Exodus. It's horrible. And then they journey back to Israel, to the land of milk and honey, back to reorder. We have the gospel story of the prodigal son. Everything was going great when he was at home, but it wasn't good enough. He wanted to go out and find something else. He did, and he found it with the pigs. He fell into the slop. It all fell apart. And then he comes home once again to the Father. So we have this theme going on. We have this story, this cycle, this process of transformation that anybody who's on a spiritual journey has to go through it. There's no way around it, folks. We all know that. You have to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And we have to give up that desire to stay in the order and to fight the disorder. You know, none of us wants to go down that journey. We resist, don't we, all the time, having to go through that tough part of the journey. And we either stay in naivete or we become control freaks. We continue to try to make this order that we had originally work. You know, it's like alcoholics who they know they have a problem, but no, they're going to manage this and we're going to be in control of it and we'll make it work until it doesn't work. There is the disorder. And now you've got to deal with all the mess that's been created. And our own little private salvation project that we all have, whether you came from the Jewish tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Catholic tradition, because whatever that tradition was that you got first, it's a theory. And you're like a duck. You're traveling really fast trying to make this thing work. And as a theory, it's not going to work. Because there's more than the theory, there's an experience. And so, in a sense, then, like Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything. It's how the light gets through. The only way we're going to fully get into this divine experience is to surrender. We have to surrender, just like in the 12 steps. You have to give up trying to have the control of this thing that is so much bigger. Like, you know, as if the mind really knows what's going on. But the divine in us knows what's going on. And we can trust that divine to inspire us, to lead us, to guide us. The interesting thing is that the first stage, the order, and the reorder look the same. Looks like you're in the same place. Oh, but you're not. You've gone through quite the journey. And that whole middle section has put you on spin dry and spat you out. Richard Rohr says that from the appendix, he's talking about, in general, about this process. He says, I have observed that the implications of this journey are different for those who identify as either conservative or liberal. Conservatives must let go of their illusion that they can order and control the world through religion, money, war, or politics. This is often their real security system. Their intense religious language often shows itself to be a pretense and a cover for a very conservative politics. True release of control to God will show itself as compassion and generosity and less boundary keeping. Liberals, however, must surrender their belief in permanent disorder and their horror of all leadership, eldering, growing old, or authority, and find what was good, healthy, and deeply true about a foundational order. This will normally be experienced as a move towards humility and real community. They must stop reacting against all authority and tradition and recognize these are necessary for continuity in a culture along with basic mental health, which allows them to belong to something besides themselves. So in general, society is dealing with this same problem. We just have different ends of the spectrum and ways to come at it. But the truth is, at the end of the day, disorder has to be thrust upon us. None of us are going to put our hands up and say, I'll go. It's forced upon us. Life says, I'm going to crack you open. And you have got to learn that it's okay to be cracked open because there's a big safety net around you because you already are the divine. So what stage in the process are you at? Do you think if you're in stage 1, 2, or 3, are you in order now? Is that what you feel? Are you in disorder? Like you notice these cycles. Geez, I thought I had all this together. You know, that's the old ego coming back. Even if you're in unity, you can say, well, I thought I had figured this out. I thought unity had the answer, for God's sake. Why am I here? Because you're going through this process all the time. It's a never-ending process. It's a transformative process. It's not something that you do once and then you got it. Having worked for hospice, we will go through that process very much at the end. So today, you may be in the reorder stage overall, but again, there's another cycle going on inside of that. Where are you at today? Just good to acknowledge. And so we go back then to the how. How do we get into this material and make it a living experience for us, a practice? And of course, it's going to feel like surrender. It's going to feel like allowing, and it's going to feel like listening and maybe not acting always so much until we really get the answer, until we get the message and the intuition. And that's uncomfortable for us because we want something more definite, don't we? And it's shedding a way of thinking that the mind just does every day, like the little guinea pig. It's on its treadmill. And every morning we get up. You can notice this. You're often running. You have to stop yourself and say, hey, wait a sec. Joe Dispenza talks about that. We are so conditioned to just respond, to do the exact same thing those first 5 minutes we're up. We have to break that up, change it up. And we want to embody this spirit. We don't want to go up and out. We want to go deep down inside and in. The finite, the concrete, the particular, that's the doorway to the divine. Not escaping somehow out there. And one of the things that Richard shares in his book is a wonderful meditation. He calls it the practice of simply that you are. Not what you are, but it's getting in touch with the fact that you just are. You are this beingness. You are this isness. Don't get into all of the other things that you add onto it because it just confuses things. Stay with that primal energy of beingness. And there, where you don't have all these thoughts and you're not having all these reactions, you're just in this open space of beingness. And that's the point where we can come into touch then with our connection with everything and with everyone. And that's where we can know our unity. And he says in the second exercise that God is a mirror for us. That everything we're seeing is a reflection of who we are and what we are. We are the original creator of all of this, and we're simply seeing ourselves every time we look out. All of this is us, and it's magnificent as we are. The physical universe is meant to reveal ourselves to ourselves. And in the final stages of the book, of course, he brings it all back to the fact that all of this is for and about one thing. It's about love. It's about loving our true self, the self that contains all of this and everything.